What's going on, everyone? It's Friday. Hope everyone's doing well today. Hope you're ready for the weekend. Hope you have some good plans for the weekend. Friday, probably my second favorite day of the week. Maybe third. Third. Saturday is probably my favorite. Sunday, I don't know, Monday. Anyways, today we are going to continue on, as long as my voice holds up, continue on the third part of Harriet Tubman. Somebody yesterday, after the reading, actually came up to me, said, "Hey, you know what? I like this story too." That's what I'm talking about. So there's at least me and one other person that like this story. So that's good. Also, yesterday, I haven't signed the contract yet, but I think the negotiations are done. So StreamYard, I usually pay StreamYard, not for these, but on my on my channel, my YouTube channel or whatever, Facebook, I pay for the streaming service every month. But another streaming service, they're just starting. They're still in what's called beta. They're not even available to the public, but they reached out to me last week and they're like, "Hey, we want to sponsor you. Let's talk." So I had that meeting with them yesterday. They know what they're going to get. I know what I'm going to get. I just haven't signed, I just emailed them like, I thought you were supposed to send along a contract, just because you just want, it's fine to talk about what we're going to do, but when it's in writing, it's just like, no doubt about it. Okay, I'm going to do this for you, and then you're going to do this for me, which basically means pay me. So, but I'm sure it'll come. Sometimes I think we ended after business hours yesterday, so it's fine. But he said he was going to send it. Maybe that's the first red flag. So long story short, I'm not sure if I will continue with it. Like you can see, StreamYard is always up in the corner. Maybe the logo will change up there, or maybe it'll be totally different, but whatever. Anyways, that's what's going on with me. So I just have to learn a new type of streaming service. So, but that's fine. So we're going to pick up right where we left off. If you remember the first time we read, she knocked at the door, 11 people, too many. And then the next time, one of the last things we read, she knocked at the door and they're like, come on in. And the last, we just started, I think, one paragraph. It was go on or die. So hopefully at the beginning of class, I asked you what that might mean based on what we saw in the documentary. So hopefully somebody said, well, she might have to threaten somebody with a gun. And that's what happens. You can imagine, it's tough what they're doing. Always worried about your safety. All right, I want to make sure that this is nice and big. Get a little bigger right there. Don't need to strain anybody's eyes today. And this is right where we left off. The last thing we talked about was muteness. So paragraph 33. 2 nights later, she was aware that the feet behind her were moving slower and slower. She heard the irritability in their voices, knew that soon someone would refuse to go on. She started talking about William Still and the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. You can see right down there, it's a group of citizens that help escape slaves. And even the leader, secretary, I should say, was a free black man, William Still. No one commented. No one asked any. Oh, wait, should we look at the picture here? Does it tell us what the picture is? Not really, huh? So, I don't know. You can take a look at the picture and imagine some dogs or some kids. I don't know. Maybe it's anybody want to take a gander at what this might be? I don't know. There is a couple, I would consider them probably white. This dude looks like he is hurt and he's got a hurt back. So maybe this is maybe a safe house right up there. And these are maybe Quakers trying to help people into the house for safety. Yeah, could be. But they traveled mostly at night, and this looks like it's daytime. So, well, no caption, but that's okay. No one asked any questions. She told them the story, make this a little bigger, of William and Ellen Craft and how they escaped from Georgia. Ellen was so fair that she looked as though she were white. So she dressed up in man's clothing, and she looked like a wealthy young planter. Her husband, William, who was dark, played the role of her slave. Thus, they traveled from Macon, Georgia to Philadelphia, riding on the trains, staying at the finest hotels. Ellen pretended to be very ill. Her right arm was in a sling, and her right hand was bandaged because she was supposed to have rheumatism. I don't know, what is that? That's not rheumatism. I don't know what that is. Not important. Feel free to look it up, but I thought when I first read this, I thought it was rheumatism, but that definitely is not rheumatism. But this is what you should probably do. Like real life, I'm not really concerned with what that is. I'm going to keep on going, but maybe it has something to do with why her arm is in a sling, right? Who cares? Keep on moving. It's not that important to the story. Thus, she avoided having to sign the register at the hotels, for she could not read or write. They finally arrived safely in Philadelphia and then went on to Boston. No one said anything. Not one of them seemed to have heard her. She told them about Frederick Douglass, the most famous of the escaped slaves, of his eloquence, of his magnificent appearance. Then she told them of her own first vain effort at running away. So if something happens in vain, I know we all have veins in our body, but if something happens in vain, it doesn't work. It's not happening. Fruitless. That's another vocabulary term you might know. If something is fruitless, it just doesn't work. So she was not able to escape the first time, evoking the memory of that miserable life she had led as a child, reliving it for a moment in the telling. But they had been tired too long, hungry too long, afraid too long, footsore too long. One of them suddenly cried out in despair, "Let me go back. It's better to be a slave than to suffer like this in order to be free." You know what Harriet's going to do, right? We don't even have to read that. She's going to use that gun. But remember, in the video we watched, she never actually had to use it. She just had to show it a couple times. Maybe, I don't know much about guns, but maybe you're not moving. That might get somebody's attention. I don't think she had a shotgun though. Maybe I don't know. That would be quite an effect if she could do that. I don't think it goes into the type of gun she has here, unfortunately. She carried a gun with her on these trips. She had never used it, except as a threat. Now, as she aimed it, she experienced a feeling of guilt, remembering that time years ago when she had prayed for the death of Edward Brodus, the master, and then not too long afterward, had heard the great wailing cry that came from the throats of the field hands and knew from the sound that the master was dead. So it seems like, probably she was, I don't know, maybe she got punished or whatever. And so she was all mad and she wished that person dead. Hopefully you've never done that to your parents, right? I wish you were dead. That's quite the thing. But anyways, see that in shows sometimes like that. That's pretty extreme. But so she did, she wanted the master to die. He died. But it seemed like the people in the fields were not exactly happy. They were like crying. They're probably not crying because he's dead. I don't think they cared. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe some of them cared. But anybody have any idea why that would be a huge deal for the people, for the slaves, if the master died? I'll pause it there. Hopefully we had a decent discussion, but it probably meant that their lives were going to change pretty rapidly. If you remember in the video we watched, it is possible that, and certainly for some of the older slaves that really weren't, of much use anymore, again, horrible to say about people, they were probably granted their freedom, whatever. But a lot of times maybe in the will, they were given to a family member. Maybe they would go to the wife and stay right on the plantation. But you can imagine there would be some upheaval and maybe some families would be split up, things like that. So it would definitely have impacted the slaves. And just think, like, if you're living in the South as a slave, right? Maybe like an older slave, maybe like in your 60s. So you're probably not really, you just can't work that hard anymore. You're not in your prime. But if you get your freedom, it's like another whole thing. Like, A, I don't have any education. B, I'm probably just going to stay on the plantation. And, it was so hard to make that jump with no education, no money. It's not like, it would have been tough. So a lot of times it is just easier to stay on the plantation, the life. If you remember from Harriet Tubman, the video we saw, like her husband didn't want to leave. He was just kind of content. He was a free guy already. So it was like, And that's what happened also too. Like we think of like the Emancipation Proclamation, like the paper signed to free the slaves, or maybe you don't, but I think a lot of people are like, oh, yay, everybody's free. Like, no, it wasn't like that. There was a lot of like, people in the South saying this paper is not going to make me change anything. And then there was a term called sharecroppers after slavery ended, which was basically like, okay, yeah, former slaves were free, but they didn't have any money to leave. They couldn't. So they just kind of stayed on the plantation and worked. Probably were paid really crappy wages, but that's what sharecropping was. It was like, so it wasn't overnight, just like, hey, signing this paper and all things were good. I know some people are doing a project in Mr. Bim's class with the 1960s. Things were still horrible in the South if you were Black. So the Civil Rights Act was signed in 1964. And I mean, even then, really? Somebody in Washington signed a paper, so now I have to change? Like, no, it's not quite that easy. Things happen really, really slowly. All right, a little bit more here. One of the runaways said again, let me go back, stood still, and then turned around and said over his shoulder, I'm going back. She lifted the gun, aimed it at the despairing slave. She said, go on with us or die. The husky, low-pitched voice was grim. He hesitated for a moment. Then he joined the others. They started walking again. She tried to explain to them why none of them could go back to the plantation. If a runaway returned, he would turn traitor. The master and the overseer would force him to turn traitor. The returned slave would disclose the stopping places, the hiding places, the corn sacks they used with the full knowledge of the owner of the farm, the name of the German farmer who had fed them and sheltered them. These people who had risked their own security to help runaways would be ruined, fined, imprisoned. She said, we got to go free or die. Freedom's not bought with dust. This time she told them about the long agony of the Middle Passage on the old slave ships, about the black horror of the holds, about the chains, the whips. They too knew these stories, but she wanted to remind them of the long, hard way they had come, about the long, hard way they had yet to go. And she told them about Thomas Sims, the boy picked up on the streets of Boston and sent back to Georgia. She said when they got him back to Savannah, got him in prison there, they whipped him until a doctor who was standing by watching said, you'll kill him if you strike him again. His master said, let him die. One real quick, like just think about this too. Again, when you're talking about owning people, it's a horrible thing, but 9 times out of 10, the owner doesn't want the slave to die because that's free labor for them, minus the food that you have to, it's simply just like a farm animal. If you're raising a pig to later be eaten, right? You have to feed that pig and all that stuff. So literally slaves, farm animals, farm equipment, it's all the same thing. So slave owners, were reluctant to actually kill slaves. They didn't want that. I mean, of course, they didn't want to like necessarily injure them so that they couldn't work. But, whippings and stuff, you could go, I mean, you'd probably be in a ton of pain, but you still had your legs and your arms, you could still work. So that was a bold move for the slave owner to actually kill one of his slaves. But I'm sure he did that to like send a message. Hey, this could happen to you. So everything was done with a purpose. So if he let that happen to one of his slaves, than it was to send a message like, hey, anybody else, you think about running, this is going to happen to you. So, and another thing that, I don't know, I learned this again from one of my college professors at the University of Alabama, and it stuck with me, is that if there was a particularly dangerous job on the plantation, and the example he used was if dynamite had to, like, if you're building something on the plantation, you had to use dynamite to whatever, remove a rock or a boulder, you probably didn't want your slaves to be doing that, because if they died doing a job, then you were out like the rest of their lives. You were out of that work. But what you could do was hire somebody an hourly wage, which is pretty awful to think about. And so if that person died, you wouldn't be, out any money. So just awful. Slavery, like the worst, right? Thinking about owning other people. Tragic. Awful. All right. So lots of reading today, probably a few more stories than reading, but hopefully it gave you like a bigger picture of just how awful this stuff was. And unfortunately, not to go too far off, that we're not exactly talking about this, but some people say, okay, again, I haven't done the research on this, I haven't backed it up, but some people say there are more slaves on earth now than there have ever been. So I don't know, hopefully not in this country. I mean, every so often it happens. People are just forced to work and mostly doing like, housekeeping, maid kind of work and stuff like that. But it's just awful in other countries. I don't know. I haven't done the research, so I'm just kind of blabbing here. But for the World Cup in Qatar, there's a lot of slave labor that was talked about. People coming from mostly like Bangladesh, India, and the Philippines, apparently. And people would go over and they would get caught over there, and then the wages were awful. The living conditions were awful. So I don't know. I guess I'm really happy that I don't have to take jobs that are super dangerous. All right, babbling. Time to work in class. Maybe a little Frankenbeans at the end. Then we got the weekend